right, gang, we're here again with another episode of Good Books Online, and today I have with me Bill Yancey, who has written Abandoned, MIA in Vietnam. Tell us a little bit about the story.
Well, without giving away the plot, that's kind of hard to do, but this is a story about a guy who is thrown off a ship in Vietnam. He has some enemies, and about 40 years later, a close friend of his hears his name or sees his name and didn't realize that this guy had disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes to find what had happened to him, where he ended up.
And it's kind of a lost and found and lost story,
Yeah.
because the story opens up with the guy, Jimmy, getting thrown off of the aircraft carrier Riscony, and of course the bad guys assume he's dead, and so does he for a while,
Yeah.
right? And then the story basically goes between trying to figure out if he is alive, and then it goes into the backstory with what happens to him in Vietnam.
Right.
So it's kind of like two stories in one. It's a whodunit wrapped in an MIA POW story as well.
Correct.
How long did it take you to write Abandoned?
Well, I started after the Super Bowl. I don't write during football season, so I started after the Super Bowl, and I finished the first week in June probably, and then got it published in July.
Got to keep your priorities straight, right, Bill?
That's right. I'm getting ready to do some more research. So football season's starting, so I read during football season.
Yeah, and I've read the book a couple of times, and a lot of the story is very true to life. How much of it was based from your life?
Well, the shipboard episodes
Mhm.
are all basically true.
Okay.
The retired guy is basically true. Okay, so the fictional part is Jimmy Burns.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. So you're basically Abby, the doctor, right?
Yeah. I'm a retired doctor, so yeah,
There
that
you
fits.
go.
Yeah.
So how did you get started with this book? I mean, what was the spark that really made you decide to write this?
I went to high school with a guy named Barry Lockhart,
Mm-hmm.
and actually I went to prep school with him first at Sullivan's in Washington, D.C. He was trying to get in the Air Force Academy, and I was trying to get in West Point. And my dad was a West Point grad, so he said, I went to Sully's, and so you're going to go to Sully's. I said, okay. So spent 6 weeks at Sully's, and I met this guy, Barry Lockhart. Well, it turns out that when I finished at Sully's, my dad had been transferred to Pentagon.
Right.
And so we stayed in the area, and I went to Francis C. Hammond High School. It turns out that Barry was at Francis C. Hammond High School, so we were pretty good
Okay.
friends senior year. But he was the guy everybody wanted to be. He was a basketball player, he was a good-looking guy, the girls all loved him, he was smart as a whip, and he did go to the Air Force Academy. And he graduated in 1969, and his dad was a bomber pilot in World War II. So he went into bombers and was flying B-52s over Hanoi the last week of the war, and was one of the guys who was missing in action.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually they found his body and brought him home in 1989. But I've been thinking for years, you know, I'd like to honor his service and honor him. But I've also been thinking, you know, wouldn't it be great if there was some place where all these guys were still alive?
Right.
And so that kind of triggered the story. So
Yeah, it was kind of interesting because I liked the part because, you know, it kind of jumps back and forth between Abby and Jimmy. And what was interesting was after Jimmy ends up in the water, he ends up getting rescued by some Vietnamese fishermen.
right.
But
Who
the
actually-
problem is they're having some problems too. They need to be rescued, right?
That's right. There you go. And Jimmy is a bright guy, and his father's in the Navy.
Right.
His father is a Naval Academy graduate and a pilot. So he spends a lot of time away from home, or the father spends a lot of time away from home, and Jimmy inherits his dad's magazines, including Mechanics Illustrated. So
Right, of course.
he learns all these tricks, and one of the tricks saves everybody's lives on the
fishing boat,
on
right.
the fishing boat. So.
Yeah, but then of course what happens is, you know, as they say, no good deed goes unpunished, right? So the next thing you know, they get back to their home port, and of course it's this little Vietnamese village, right?
Just south of the DMZ.
That's right. And so of course everybody's happy to see, you know, the fishermen, of course, him alive, and you know, if they give him all this, ply him with food and liquor, and the next thing he knows, tell him what happens next. Oops.
Whoops. The Viet Cong also live in that village.
That's right.
And so they take him captive.
Yeah, and that's where his saga really
That's
begins.
right.
Because most people don't realize, they think, of course, that I think a lot of people have the World War II kind of thing where you're put in some big stockade somewhere, but that's not really the way it worked in Vietnam for most part.
There were a great many guys who were captured in the South and marched to the North when the Vietnamese decided that these were pawns that could be used in negotiations.
Of course, right.
In fact, I had a book review by a guy who was a POW, a guy named Richard Stratton, who lives here in Jacksonville at Fleet Landing. And I don't know the man, but I saw his review on Amazon. And in fact, I ought to read part of it to you.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I got to put my glasses on so I can see it.
Well, we're both in that boat, Bill.
Anyway, Captain Stratton was one of the first POWs put on TV during the Vietnam War. And our thinking at the time was that he'd been drugged and brainwashed. And it turned out he was just acting so people would understand that they were being tortured. Mm-hmm. But this is what he wrote. He said, "This is a good read. It's a credible storyline, a real-world description of Navy and captive life." Mm-hmm. Quoting him, "I served as a squadron line maintenance officer on aircraft carriers, so the hangar deck and liberty sequences rang true. I shared a cell with a sailor who fell off a ship and became a POW. He was listed as a possible suicide. The crew believed he'd been reneged on a gambling debt and was tossed overboard, and the truth was stranger than friction. This rang true. The cruelty of North Vietnamese captors I experienced from 1967 to 1969 was inventive. This rang true. I lived with survivors of POW marches from South Vietnam to North Vietnam and learned their stories. Too true." And he goes on and talks about how this book, in his estimation, is a very real book, and which surprised me because there's a lot of fiction in this book.
Right.
But I did a lot of reading before I got to write it. So.
Yeah, because a lot of the tales, again, the things that Jimmy was going through, because it was more or less, he was almost conscripted himself.
Right.
Because it's not like, first of all, they weren't worried about him running off, because where was he going to run to? And of course, they were feeding him so little that he was half starved. He wouldn't make it very far. In fact, one time, a pilot gets brought into camp, and after he saves his life, of course, the pilot thinks he's Vietnamese because he's Oriental, and of course, at that point, he's half starved, so he looks just like the Vietnamese.
Absolutely.
So he thinks he's more or less a spy.
Right. The other side of the coin is written into the book also. The Vietnamese were basically abandoned by their government.
Right.
They fought a war without any support. They had no medics. They had no vaccines. Mm-hmm. They died of tetanus. They died of infection. They died in tremendous rates. They carried half their people off the battlefield, so we couldn't count them.
Right.
And after the war was over, the Vietnamese suffered again because the North came down and tortured all the Southerners who fought against them. Mm-hmm. And then there was the boat people who left Vietnam, and they suffered again, trying to escape. A lot of them were captured and beaten by pirates from Thailand, as well as their own government. And the government is so corrupt that they would let these people leave and capture them and bring them back and take their gold again. It's just amazing.
Oh yeah, well, and even the Vietnamese people. I mean, it wasn't just the North versus the South. I mean, they didn't just fight us. They fought the French. They fought the Japanese during the Second World War. I mean, well, they were more or less born into that, and also the entire country was not only the psychology of the country, but even just the landscape, all the tunnels that go underneath there and everything. Now, of course, they're tourist traps, right?
Right. Yeah.
You can actually take tours of the tunnels.
The tunnels and the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Right.
You can go all over Vietnam and see a lot of this stuff. You can see blown up tanks, blown up aircraft. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that place will never be the same. In fact, during one part of the book, you talked about an Arclight, which is of course a B-52 raid.
Right.
And Jimmy was kind of caught in the middle of it. And that's one of the most terrifying things to ever go through, because I mean you would have dozens of bombers just basically carpet bombing the entire jungle, whatever was in there.
Yeah, a flight of three,
Yeah.
each one carrying 100, 500-pound bombs.
Right.
They just lead a path that was 5
like
miles long and a mile wide. Just
Yeah.
devastation.
Yeah, and in fact, during that part, he gets split up from the other POW, and they each think each one's dead because, of course, everything in between is like a moonscape at that point.
Right.
So, like I said, some of the stories in there, I mean, you must have done a great deal of research for it, because they definitely rang true. And I've read quite a lot of Vietnamese literature and novels and things like that over the years. So how did you find a lot of your research material?
Well, I went online. It's nice, the first book I wrote, 1983, there was no online.
Right.
I was in the library. I'd write about, a chapter and say, gee, I don't know the answer to that question myself. How in the world am I going to answer this? So I go to the library and spend a week in the library, find the answer. Now you just click online and say, oh, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. Well, it's even more interesting. I mean, I've written a novel myself, and actually I wrote 2 novels. My first one took me 6 years. My second one took me 6 months. And the big difference, of course, was Google.
Right.
Because I was even able to go and get on Google Earth and look at a spot on the planet, from space and say, okay, this is exactly where it is, without having to jump on a jet to go there. The research is a lot easier today.
Absolutely, and you can tell, how far distance are when you're walking or driving. Right. It's super.
So how long did you research this before you started writing it?
Football season.
Really? Just 1 year?
Yeah, just football season. I read some books by a dissident, a lady who was born the same year I am, so she's the same age I am. She's 69 years old now, she's still alive, and she fought in the North Vietnamese army against the Americans and against the Chinese, and then realized after the war was over that they didn't gain anything.
Right.
They were still under somebody's thumb. It was communist thumb. So she became a dissident, and she's written several books. I've read 2 of her books. And they're both heartbreaking, basically.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like you said, there were no winners or losers. I mean, everybody's a loser in that war, basically.
Well, probably every war. There aren't many good wars.
Right, that's true. There's just a lot of them.
Yeah, that's
true.
But
everybody loses in a war. And what was interesting in the book was the fact that you not only represented, our side of the story, but you talked about a lot of what happened to the Vietnamese over there and the hardships that they had to go through. That's what made it really, it was a very true life story as far as what happened to, the people that were basically supposed to be guarding Jimmy. After a while, he was guarding them. Right. It's just that depending on who came along to find who was doing what, that he would suffer some repercussions from both sides.
Right. The research was eye-opening. It really was. A lot of stuff went on that I was in the theater. Okay, right. I was up in the Gulf of Tonkin for 18 months, and of course I didn't know what went on land. I did know what went on in the carrier, but the millions of people who died, the civilians, and it really was eye-opening. And the book changed while I was doing that. It was initially this was going to be a revenge story. Jimmy got tossed off a boat. Jimmy's going to go back and kill everybody and get some revenge. But he wouldn't do that. That's the funny thing. When I write a book, the characters do what they want. You never control the characters.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. After a while, if your book is working, they start telling you what's going to happen, and you'll have characters appear that you didn't have any idea were going to come along, but here they are.
Absolutely correct.
That's when you know you're on the right track too with the book. So is this? You said you wrote another book.
I've written 10 books.
Okay, so tell us a little bit. I mean, what other books have you read that the readers might be interested in seeing?
Oh, well, Addison Wolf is a doctor. The first book about him is called Reluctant Intern.
Right.
And it's about his internship.
Okay.
The second book about him is Deadly Practice. And that's about working for a living in the medical field and working for somebody who is really only in it for money. And Addison doesn't like that, of course. So there's a three book series with Addison. And then the first book I wrote was called The Last Day. It's about the terrorists stealing a bomb from the Soviet Union and planting it on a ship in one of the harbors of the United States.
Okay.
And that's the one that took forever to write. Just forever and ever.
So can they find these all on Amazon?
They find them all on Amazon if they're really interested, and you can get them in print too. I have a friend who actually went over to Books A Million and ordered the book, and they told him they would get it for him, but it'd be a week.
Yeah, you don't have to wait. And in fact, if you want to find out more about Abandoned, MIA in Vietnam, you can go to Good Books Online, where we have some sample chapters for you. Of course, as soon as I produce this video, that will also be linked there. There'll be a bio. There's a blurb from the book, so you can learn all about it. And if you want to go buy it, there's actually going to be the link to Amazon as well. Great. Pleased to have you on the show.
Well, I appreciate you
and keep us in the loop on future books.
I will.
All right. Other than that, folks, until next week, keep reading good books. Thanks.